Good evening, everyone. I'm Leah Brick. I'm the Executive Director at SASH. Thanks for joining us tonight for this webinar with Dr. Erica Saar. So grateful she can be with us. This is a great webinar. You're in for a treat with her, and it's just a lot of fun. With that, I'm going to turn it over to you, Erica, to get started. And thank you again for being here with us tonight.
Always my pleasure. Glad to be here. So, welcome everybody. This is one of my favorite talks that I've ever put together. So I'm excited to be spending this little bit of time with you guys. If you see me looking down, it's because I put my notes on a different device so I could kind of go back and forth. But so I promise I'm 100% here with you. So just a little bit about who I am. So I am the executive director of General Path and Willow House at the Meadows, which are residential treatment centers for sex addiction, sexual compulsivity, sexual trauma. Basically, if it has to do with sex and it's of a sufficient severity that somebody needs to go to a hospital, that's what we do. And that's the end of my spiel. That's mainly so you know who I am and what I do. It's a new role for me. I only recently, well, it's less recently now, about half a year ago, moved into the executive director roles where I'm really more responsible for business. But I am hardcore clinician. So I have a clinical psychology doctorate, which is my primary training. But if you look at my addiction to letters there, my MED, which is a master's of education in human sexuality, really highlights my focus. I have always been fascinated by human sexuality and every aspect of it. Just so you note the other letters, BCB means I have a board certification in biofeedback, and my CSAT-S means I'm a sex addiction therapist supervisor. So this talk was really kind of a confluence of two major loves for me, which is technology and sexuality. And I had noticed this talk kind of came about because honestly, I had clients presenting. I had clients presenting particularly with really, really challenging cases of pornography. And so I assume that folks who are coming to a SASH event know that we're going to be discussing sexuality, but just so people are aware, that will be a discussion of part of the topic. I certainly will try to use the most respectful and clinically appropriate language, but people just, take care of yourself, be aware that we're going to be talking about some sexual stuff here. There was a client we were working with, and when we started talking to him about his pornography collection, he was kind of vague. He was telling us, he's like, well, it's extensive. And we're like, well, what do you mean by extensive? And he's like 3 terabytes. That's a lot of pornography. And this was 7 years ago. And so to have a terabyte of storage, which is a much bigger deal back then than it is now, even now, it's a non-insignificant amount of storage. So I was like, that's a really interesting behavior. So we noted that. We had another client who, when we were talking about his collections, would really started to discuss these collections in a way that reminded me of folks that I had worked with some hoarding behavior in some other settings. And then finally, we had another client who presented, was talking fairly normatively about his pornography use. Maybe it was a little bit of a collection, but then his partner, when we were doing family work, finally said, has he told you about the storage sheds? And we're like, the storage sheds? And she's like, yeah, and the other house. We're like, what? And the cars. It turns out he was a classic hoarder as well as hoarding his sexual materials, and had hoarded them out of a house, had multiple storage units. And he's like, well, I didn't bring any of that up because that didn't have anything to do with the sexual behaviors that brought me into treatment. But what we found was it had the same underlying compulsive process. So that's a little bit of what we're going to talk about today. Let's rock and roll. So these are, I'm not going to read this slide, but these are the DSM5 criteria for hoarding disorder. And it's really good that hoarding has made it into the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual because people really suffer from this disorder. If you've ever seen the shows that are out there, kind of pick the most severe cases, but there are plenty of people who don't rise to the level of those shows you might see on certain channels, but still struggle quite significantly, or might have cases just as bad, but are unwilling to be filmed on television. So the core criteria are that there is a persistent difficulty parting with possessions, regardless of the value of those possessions. We'll talk a little bit more at a later point about the concept of value. That's a very interesting concept. There are strong urges to save items and a lot of emotional pain when being asked to discard the items. And this results in an accumulation of possessions, which eventually impact the functionality of the home. So we're talking about, or a workspace, we're talking about classic hoarding. You might hear me in this talk about analog hoarding, which is kind of what I'm talking about when I talk about actual physical objects versus digital hoarding, which is going to be online stuff. That this is a topic that people often know somebody. They either have somebody in their family, or they have a family friend, or they've seen a client that has this behavior, and it can bring up a lot of stuff for folks. So I appreciate when people are willing to share. So the general kind of, it has to cause distress, which is a thing that we see in all mental health conditions. It has to do that, or it has to impair functioning, including a safe environment. This is a little bit of a challenging one. The hoarding isn't due to a medical condition. In that case, we sometimes see behavior that looks like hoarding, for example, for folks who develop a frontal lobe dementia. So the frontal lobe includes our executive functioning, which is our get up and go, our follow through on action. And if somebody has experienced, for example, a vascular dementia, so a blood related, like a stroke in the frontal lobes, they might begin not caring for themselves in the same way. And that would be kind of a different issue that would probably be coded as a dementia with different features as opposed to a hoarding disorder. And in those cases, you might not see what we would call hoarding so much, which is this collecting with emotionality related to it. And you might see more of what is typically called squalor. Squalor is the term used when it's just complete neglect of the space. Like, I'm not keeping things because I care about them. I'm not keeping them because it makes me anxious to get rid of them. I just have given up and allowed things to accumulate, including dirt, feces, urine, you name it. So that, now, can they happen together? Absolutely. But sometimes those two phenomenon can get conflated. And if you do something like, for example, hoard animals, are you likely to end up with a squalor, type situation? Yes. So those go together. And then we don't want it to be related to other syndromes. An interesting one that's particularly noted in hoarding disorder is Prader-Willi syndrome, which you will only really see food hoarding as it relates to Prader-Willi, because that syndrome results in people, it develops fairly early in childhood, where people feel constantly hungry no matter how much food they eat. And so they will eat all the available food to the point of sickness. And often food has to be locked up and kept away from them in households. And so they might start hoarding food as it's related to that disorder, but you won't see generalized hoarding necessarily with that. So let's talk a little bit about kind of the psychological factors. hoarders, right? So if we think about, unlike, for a long time, we assumed that hoarding was simply an offset of OCD, that it was a particular subset of obsessive compulsive behavior. But we're finding that it has more complex features to it than that. Now, so the features that might be similar is in an obsessive compulsive disorder, I have a fear, I have a thought, right? And it could be rational, like if my hands are dirty, I could get sick. And it could be irrational, like if I don't wash my hands, planes will fall out of the sky, right? But that's the thought. So that's the obsession. That's in my head. The compulsion is the behavior that I then do that relieves that anxiety, right? So I think my hands are dirty. I wash my hands, the anxiety goes away, right? That's a normal experience for most of us, right? If I got something gross on my hands, I'm usually like, ooh, until I can wash my hands. And I'm like, relaxed. But someone with OCD, what happens is the thought is so intense that they have to repeat the behavior more and more frequently and more extremely until the point that it gets intrusive in their lives. Now, does hoarding sometimes look like that? Sure. You could say that I have anxiety that I won't have what I need. So for example, sometimes you will see food hoarding in children of people, either people who grew up during the Depression or children of people who grew up during the Depression. They are unable to discard food because they have this anxiety that there will not be food to have again. And so the anxiety is there will not be food, and the compulsive behavior is collect the food. Okay, that's very, very similar. However, what is often different with hoarding behavior, unlike OCD, is that there is a positive reinforcement and a positive emotion in regard to their behavior. So for example, I enjoy shopping. There's often very little people with OCD enjoy about their compulsions. They're like, I feel like a prisoner of having to wash my hands versus this is a pleasurable experience. But particularly we see with like co-occurring shopping and hoarding disorders, well, actually hoarding disorder has a subset with compulsive shopping. Particularly when you see that one, there's a lot of pleasure around the collecting, the looking at, the developing. But even in people who don't have shopping issues along with their hoarding, if you talk to hoarders about their hoard, you often will see this very misty, kind of joyful, kind of nostalgic reminiscence about these objects. And that's very different than OCD. There was a comment about noticing that people over collected during the pandemic, which would be particularly like basic items and things like that, which, yeah, would be a non-mental health, but a sociological manifestation of that same fear and anxiety, right? I will manage my anxiety about the potential future lack of these things by having an overabundance of these things to alleviate my current anxiety, and kind of like we'll talk about in a little bit, actually alleviating that current anxiety may help me alleviate some larger existential anxieties, like having this toilet paper alleviates my anxiety about toilet paper, and it also gives me something to do about this nebulous, frightening experience that's happening, right? As far as hoarding goes, we also often see a family history of hoarding. So we get that nature nurture effect. If I watched a family member hoard, I might become compulsively neat as a counter reaction to that, or I might also have never learned appropriate boundaries and self-management behaviors, and I will hoard similarly to my family members. It's very common to have comorbid mental health issues like depression. Sometimes we'll see hoarding behavior on the autism spectrum, PTSD, a number of places it'll show up. Family values around different things, around possessions, Waste and making decisions are the common things that we see carry over from families. Either that possessions are very important, again, kind of deprivation, like we only got one toy a year. And so no matter what, no matter how broken, no matter how soiled, you didn't get rid of the toy because that was it, right? It often comes from deprivation. Kind of along the waste category, there can be family values around being the caretakers of possessions, and that we must preserve them at all costs, even if they're possessions that we don't find value in. So, which is tough sometimes, right? I have a friend who has started a business with some colleagues where they go and collect pianos that people don't want anymore. They've been family heirlooms and things like that, and they repurpose them into other things because all these pianos were just going to the landfill, which was a shame. But also, can you imagine if you're a person who doesn't really have the money or space for a piano, but your family value is that you are the custodian of this piano, and you tried, like you called a museum and you called friends and no one wants it, and now this piano is no longer an item of joy for you, it is a burden, right? So that can be a family value around possession. Waste, so people that have a very strong anti-waste proposition often will hoard things. We'll talk in just a couple slides about the creative thinking that goes into that, but mainly it's because they can see the value in those things. They can see how they could be reused, further used, etc. And they have a high commitment to the planet, to their communities, and those are all really wonderful things. When that urge gets taken to a compulsive level, it becomes personally problematic for them, though. And then there's family values around decision making, along with some cognitive things we'll look at in a second. One of the challenges is that hoarders often come from families that are indecisive, right? They come from systems where you pick something up and you end up, should I get rid of it? Should we keep it? Well, I can think about a bunch of reasons why we would keep it. I'll just put it back down and we'll make a decision about it later. So that's kind of the family messaging stuff. Paradoxical perfectionism is, if you've ever worked with a perfectionistic workaholic who's underperforming, it's kind of the same underlying cognitive construct, which is, I can't clean the house perfectly, or I can't find the perfect place for these things or the perfect home for these things. And so I freeze. And so it never gets done. And you often see that with folks who they're too big picture thinkers. You can't keep them focused on, okay, where does this item in your hand go? And they're like, well, there's 500 items in here and I need to go look. No, where does this thing go? Let's find a home for this thing, right? And their perfectionism of needing the whole to be good overwhelms their coping. Now, another factor we see in hoarding, and this one I can attest because I had a little bit of a trigger myself for digital hoarding, can show up digitally as well, which is an adverse life event or events. Some common times that we will see analog hoarding appear in people, particularly if they didn't have it strongly, you'll see it escalate after these events. And sometimes you'll see it erupt entirely from these events, but events like war. So if you're a refugee and you literally had to leave everything you owned behind, or there was a fire and you lost everything. I remember on one of the TV shows, there was a hoarder talking about how she didn't live in deprivation. They had a perfectly financially stable family, but her father was in the military and they moved a lot. And one day he was like, you can only take what fits in this 2 suitcases. And she's like, but I have all these things I love. And he took everything she owned and burned it. because he was just frustrated with, I don't know, it sounds like there's probably a lot more going on in that family, but those kinds of things. And so then as an adult, she hoarded because she had this trauma. She always been back to that feeling she had when all of her possessions were burned. Other things that happen are people may begin hoarding, for example, after a robbery or a sexual assault. I think in a later slide, I talk about cocoons and bunkers. Bunkering is when someone who has experienced a break-in or assault begins hoarding behavior, and you will see the hoarding behavior start to block off doors and windows and make like warrens and pathways that make the person hard to get to. And so it's a survival behavior. It's a kind of a denning behavior. It's a very animalistic protective behavior, which makes sense, right? For me, I'll just give you an example. I can't hide it. I'm a giant nerd, and I'm a giant video game nerd specifically. And one of my video game accounts that I had played on for years was hacked, and everything I owned in that account was stolen. I got most of it back. Again, it's all digital. It's not actually a possession that I own. And I would classify that as traumatic. I had traumatic responses to, actually sometimes still have traumatic responses to like viruses and things, like manageable ones, not big ones that you should freak out about, but like, oh no, a pop-up thing got on my computer. I have a disproportionate response to that because I'm like, everything will be gone. And for a while, I started over backing up things because of that. So that's just a little bit of a personal thing that was kind of in there that that started me. So those are some adverse life events, and we could think of many, many more. Physical constraints. Unfortunately, a lot of folks begin hoarding when, or their hoarding behavior becomes noticeable when they're no longer able to keep up, right? When they were young, they kind of could move around and stash things, but as they get older, it's harder for them to clean or organize or things like that. And that hoarding might start to build up. Digitally, I've noticed that as I get older and my brain slows down, I can't burn through emails as quickly, and the emails kind of start backing up on me, and I certainly can't get rid of them until I've looked at them. And so that, I might call that a physical constraint of sorts. Pseudo hoarding. Again, this happens in analog and digital hoarding. Pseudo hoarding is when you have this is from a researcher named Penzel. He talked about how you're not actually attached to the stuff, but what you are attached to, or what you are afraid of, is that something useful will be discarded with the things you get rid of. So I don't care if we throw out these 500 cereal boxes, but I'm afraid my grandmother's ring is somewhere in there. And so I can't get rid of the cereal boxes till I go through each of them carefully. And the amount of time I need to go through the boxes carefully never comes, right? So that's pseudo hoarding. And then just like any other behavior, there's a spectrum of severity, right? I will jokingly poke fun at myself a number of times because I feel like, having studied this, actually like given myself the exams, feel like I'm more chronically disorganized than hoarding, but I'm on a bad day, I'm like, there's the low end of hoarding stuff showing up for me. Probably wouldn't end up on a TV show, which is good, right? But there are people who literally have vehicles that they can't move. They have houses they can't live in. They have storage units they can't pay for, which destroy their lives. So there's kind of a spectrum there. So when we think about collecting, and honestly, if you watch the kind of the hoarding shows and things, they've started talking much more about addiction, which really pleases me, because I was like, I can't be the only person noticing this overlap. So in traditional hoarding, you see two main forms: either compulsive purchasing or acquisition of free items. The problem, I think, for many of us in the digital realm is the acquisition of free items, i.e., that could be emails, texts, pictures, memes, links, et cetera, et cetera. Like those things don't cost us until we have to pay for storage. But nowadays, the paying for storage thing, we'll actually talk about that a little bit as kind of a different one of the arguments that people make that is digital hoarding. Hoarding, I still say yes, but it's an interesting argument. In a smaller subset of folks, you might see stealing, or even potentially kleptomania show up as a co-occurring behavior. But for most hoarders, the acquiring, not just the acquiring, but the anticipating acquiring elicits an intensely pleasurable response, even for some of them, like euphoric response. And my kind of question there is, think about other behaviors where there's kind of a hunt involved in an addictive process, right? Particularly if I'm talking about like sex addicts or people who are sexually compulsive. The best part of their cycle is the chase. The best part is anticipating, I'm going to go out, I'm going to look good, I'm going to meet somebody, we're going to flirt, that's going to be exciting, and then we're going to have an encounter, and that will be great. The encounter itself is hopefully pleasurable for somebody, but oftentimes not near as pleasurable as they thought. But the arc can be hours, days, months, right? If we think about, sometimes people are like, I'm going to go meet my affair partner and I'm keeping this secret for all this time, and being able to keep the secret and having that power feels really good. I see that same kind of anticipatory intent in a lot of gambling addicts or other kinds of spending, but like gambling, like I'm going to find that exact right table or that exact right machine and this exact right dealer and this exact right time. And then I'm going to, or exact right horse running the race. And then I'm going to win and it's going to be so good. So that anticipatory pleasure is a really big part of this process, just like it is in addictions. I told you that we would talk about some of the things that internally drive the collection. And this is both analog and digital. And I always start, I'll read a few, of the chat things if people miss them. I would just like people to throw in the chat, tell me some uses for that blue pen cap that I have shown on my screen. What are some ways you could use that blue pen cap? An ear scratcher. That one comes up a lot. I think there's a lot of itchy ears in the world, or a lot of us who have itched our ears with those. To clean your fingernails, to pick your teeth, just to chew on when you're stressed or just thinking. What else? Stretch yourself. Like if you as a pin to top a different pen, to use as a bookmark or a page holder. Well, good. So you guys have thought of a number of options, right? That, and I've heard if I kept you for a long time, if I was like, we're not leaving here until we get 50 ideas, we could get 50 ideas. You could use it to use it as a makeshift screwdriver. So you needed to use it to turn a screw. Some people were like, well, you could use it as like a replacement board game piece. You could melt it down because the blue is so pretty, you could melt it down and turn the plastic into something else. You could use it to like I have heard a lot. People got real creative when I hold them to it. One of the characteristics of many hoarders is that they are able to find so many uses for every single thing that they own. And it hits on a number of these characteristics. So I'm going to tell you what these different characteristics means. So sympathetic magic is the idea that the mojo of another person can be held in this object, right? I won't say all of us, but a lot of us have some degree of sympathetic magic, or we wouldn't ask celebrities for their autographs, right? Celebrity autographs are a form of sympathetic magic. Just because Tom Cruise signed this poster, somehow now it has more value. It has created a connection. It's the same reason you can say, Thomas Jefferson touched this handkerchief, or it doesn't have to be that big. It can be, I can't get rid of this t-shirt because my ex-boyfriend used to wear it. And even though it doesn't smell like him anymore, it's like he's still here, right? That's a more personal sympathetic magic. Or some people are fine and don't really have active hoarding behavior until their parents die. And suddenly they have all of their parents' belongings, and throwing out any part of their parents' belongings feels like a rejection of some part of their parents. And so they're like, well, I guess I have to keep everything. And that's usually not functional. Another thing that you see in hoarders is their ability to find beauty in the unusual. Artists, writers, anybody can. I find like artists in whatever stripe can really, really struggle if they have this hoarding type behavior, because they could tell you 1,000 ways that they could use that pen cap. And so if I could find 1,000 uses for an object, it feels really ridiculous to get rid of it. Somebody asked the question around the sympathetic magic: is holding on to clothing of dead loved ones part of a grieving process? Potentially, right? And that might be part of the hoarding therapy. So like, for example, this happens a lot with, say, like love and relationship addiction. Somebody might have every email and every text I shared with a partner, and they died. Like, let's say they died. So we're talking about grieving. Like, let's take it to both grieving, like end of relationship grieving or death grieving. They have everything. Now, is maybe keeping one or two really poignant things? Sure, right? I can think of examples of that in my own life. There's one or two poignant voicemails or letters or emails that, I want to keep. But if you are talking with your client and you're like, hey, this text that says, and not on the day that their relationship ended or the person died, but there's this text that says, do we need milk? And I ask you, on a scale of 0 to 100, 0 being no anxiety and 100 being complete panic attack, how anxious would you be if this text, out of all the text you have, this text that says, hey, do we need milk, was to be deleted? And they're like 99. Okay, like that's something to be processed. Now, if it's the day after the person died, we're not going to do that work because we're not yet into complicated grief. We're in normative grief, right? But it's 5 years from the last time, from the end of the relationship. Even if that digital space, even if they have enough room on their phone to keep every text, what kind of emotional space is that hoard taking up? If that text that says, do we need milk, still causes a 99 out of 100 anxiety. So sometimes in the digital realm, we're talking less about physical space, and it gets a bit more existential, more abstract, where we're talking about this digital space. Some folks, and I don't think the chats went to everybody, but they're talking about saving artwork and saving school stuff and things like that, and some things like, so you're telling me to throw this stuff out? Not necessarily, right? There are different, because if I told you what to do, I could potentially traumatize you, and I'm not interested in ending this talk with anybody traumatized. For example, I think I love my mother, but we have very different emotional thresholds with stuff. And I know that if I was just like, well, you throw out, it's been really interesting as we've talked about our stuff, like we just did it over the holidays, and stuff that I got rid of. She goes, interesting. Some of that stuff I thought you would really want. And there's sometimes I'd be like, where's this thing? And she goes, what does that have to do with anything? I was like, oh, that's a thing that has a lot of emotional value to me. And so it's been an interesting journey. Sometimes when I talk to people with hoarding, they're like, well, I want to save this for my kids. And I'm like, okay, are you going to be emotionally prepared if you save it for your kids? And like, let's say they're not like 6, but they're like 20 and they're old enough to make decisions. And you're like, here's this stuff. And they're like, no, thank you. Like, what is that going to do for you? We're going to talk about items as self here in a second. That's an important thing to think about with hoarders. The beauty in the unusual, I want to give a digital example of finding usefulness in everything and how that can become a problem even digitally. When I was writing my dissertation, I had to make a file that was called Not Now, Erica, because I have a brain that can make connections to pretty much anything. And I kept finding these really cool articles that I wanted that led me to other cool articles. And I could read cool articles on cool articles. And then I was like, well, maybe I can loop this back in to my dissertation. And finally, I had to be like, do you want to finish your dissertation? Yes, I do. Do you want to finish it this year? Yes, I do. Put those files in the not now folder and don't look at them again. Now, once I finished my dissertation, I gave myself permission to look at them. And then a lot of them, I was like, okay, I don't, there were some things that I kept to turn into other talks and things, but it's that same thinking that I could have hoarded myself out of my dissertation, essentially, if I wasn't careful. Memory. So a thing, we'll talk about the specific neurological deficits, but a thing that we know is that many people diagnosed with hoarding disorder actually have specific kinds of memory deficits, and they keep objects as visual cues. And they're afraid that if they discard the objects, that they will lose the memory. And sometimes it's so severe where it will be like, I have 500 pictures of my grandmother, but this one that has a coffee stain on it, if I throw it out, I'm afraid I won't remember either that day with my grandmother, or maybe I won't remember my grandmother. That's an extreme example, but that's the anxiety. That's almost that pseudo hoarding, but not really. That one's more of a hoarding behavior. There's just this real intense anxiety that I will forget. Utility, again, we kind of talked about that when we talked about the pen cap. One of the plus sides of hoarders is that they're creative. And oftentimes, though not always, they've had to be survivors. And so they keep what's useful and they pack rat it around until they can use it to meet a particular need. What is the challenge is that they often forget they already have the thing they need in their pack rat somewhere, and they collect it again, right? So a common example that might not be to be seen on TV example, but how many people have like 4 pairs of tweezers in their house, right? Because when you need the tweezers, you can't find the dang tweezers. So then you get frustrated and you just go to CVS and buy the new tweezers, right? But that's a low level example of someone's like, well, I know we have 3 other pairs of tweezers. Yeah, but let's keep these because I don't know where those are. Control. Another reason that we hoard is control. And that, in the example that I gave of the woman whose dad burnt her clothing as a child, as an adult, she was very much insistent that no one was ever again going to tell her how much stuff she could own, ever. And that was a block for her doing therapy. And so when you think about people with trauma and how they get safety is through control, which is, I talked about the bunkers and cocoons, which is the next point. But you think about, these are manifestations that I get to decide what is in my space. And that's true, right? We do get autonomy to decide in those kinds of things. The challenge is when it becomes about the fight, and sometimes you're not the person that who thinks they're fighting with you. You're like, I'm not in the fight with you. You can have as many of these things as you want, but if you're having 40 of them, not because 40 of them make you happy, but you're having 40 of them to prove to me I can't tell you to have fewer of them, that's a different issue, right? And whether that's email addresses or mugs, we've already talked about bunkers and cocoons a little bit. Bunkers, I've already explained. Cocoons are people who like the feeling of the stuff closing them in. They get into their home and they are really finding, they find that feels safe. They find it's almost like, if you ever heard folks with like autism talk about like a crush box or a hug box, where they're like, I don't want personal touch, but I like the feeling of this object that can squeeze me because that closed feeling feels good, or even like a weighted blanket, right? Like those are more functional examples, but for some people, getting into their space feels really good. Somebody asked, does insecure attachment lead to hoarding? Yeah, for sure. I don't think you will see as many securely attached folks hoarding. You may see some who had, if you know the experience in close relationship scale, you might find people who had secure early attachment and then had a major life trauma. And then if you did their later relationship attachment, it was disrupted by that life trauma. You could see a split there, but I think a very significant percentage of people who identify as hoarders will have some sort of insecure attachment and use the objects as attachment objects. I already described responsibility and waste. Again, this idea that I have to keep stuff to not harm the planet, to not be a wasteful spender, et cetera, et cetera. The mistakes and punishment. Oftentimes, hoarders grew up in families where there was a lot of, and this is me looking at my notes again, where they were raised with rules around being punished for mistakes. And so if I can't perfectly arrange the house, I freeze. If I admit, ooh, shopping addicts do this a lot. They buy a whole bunch of stuff impulsively and then they get home and they regret it. But the shame and the fear of punishment, which is irrational because they were maybe punished in childhood, but the cashier wouldn't punish you, like they wouldn't beat you for bringing the clothes back. But there's this deep fear of punishment. And so I eat the cost, even though now I regret the clothes and won't wear the clothes. And especially now, because I regret the clothes, I'll definitely never wear them because now they're tainted with my shame around my impulse and my failure and all that. So now even owning the clothes brings me no pleasure. So those kinds of things. Digitally, I see this a lot with folks who have that same fear around punishment, but needing to keep proof. I have to prove to you that I sent that email. I have to prove to you that I wrote that. I have to prove. It's very much, I expect to be called on the carpet. And this is one of the reasons that I think I see email hoarding being a trauma reaction, particularly in a lot of clinicians, quite frankly, because we get it drilled into our head, document, which we should do in our EMR and in our notes and everything. But this idea of like, someone will be coming after you and you have to be ready to defend yourself. And so when we talk about the workaholism stuff and things like that, I think particularly when I talk to clinicians about things like email, there is this idea of like, I have to hoard these clinical objects to protect myself. Then we have sentimental reasons, sentimental reasons. And often people with hoarding disorder are often highly deep feeling folks. And there is a sense of anthropomorphism, which is this object has feelings. And so if I throw away this teddy bear, oftentimes there can be a projection of, I know how it feels to feel discarded. And I imagine how much this teddy bear is suffering when I throw it away. And so I can't do that. And if you can do that to almost every object you touch, you're going to end up in a hoarded home, right? Or you might only do that with stuffed animals. But then when you go out in the world and you see a stuffed animal that's on the sale rack, even if you don't love the teddy bear, you're like, oh, I have 500 teddy bears and that's a fairly mediocre teddy bear, but he's over there on the clearance rack and nobody loves him. And I don't want him to just be thrown in a landfill because how sad will he be? So I have to buy this teddy bear so he can come home with me because I'm protecting him and saving him. So that's some anthropomorphism that can come out. Digitally, I think we can see it in a lot of things. Honestly, we can see it in collecting emails and things. And so we keep them because even if the person wouldn't know I deleted their emails, I know how I would feel if my friends deleted an email I thought was really beautiful that I sent them. And so I have to keep this email even though it doesn't bring me any joy or pleasure. I think people do that not just for anthropomorphic reasons, for a lot of reasons. I think people do that with like followers and friends now. Like people have like toxic people in their life but they're like, well, I can't unfriend them on Facebook because it'll hurt their feelings. That doesn't mean necessarily even you're unfriending them in real life. I've known people who are like, yeah, this person my friend, but their online presence is unpleasant. It is either too much, or it's, there's something really intense, or they're drama seekers online, or whatever it is. Doesn't mean I'm not going to be their friend and we're going to go to brunch, we're going to hang out, but I don't like their attention seeking online, and I would like to unfriend them, but then that means I don't love them. And I'm like, ooh, okay. So there's a little bit of a difference there.
I do have a question that came up.
Totally.
It sort of relates to what you're talking about, and it's about saving a dead parent's voicemail.
Yeah, that's again, that's a mix between the sentimental and that sympathetic magic. That's kind of a really interesting individual process, right? If it's a single voicemail, does it meet the criteria of hoarding? Probably not. But if I have to keep it in my voicemail, and every time I hear it, it makes me parasuicidal, then we're talking a different disorder, right? We're probably talking like complex grief or complicated grief. Does that necessarily mean that they shouldn't, download that voicemail somewhere and still keep it? Maybe not, right? Like that's an individual therapeutic process. But now if somebody, again, is, because my dad is dead, I have to keep every hair was in his razor, then we have complicated grief plus some hoarding now. But when it's an individual, particularly if it's an individual touchstone voicemails or items, some people through the therapeutic process of resolving their grief, some of that will be they decide to get rid of the object, right? Particularly if you think about end of relationships. Some people decide, okay, it's time to throw away my ex-boyfriend's photos and get rid of his shirt because I want to create space in my life. Even though I'm grieving the end of that relationship, I want to create space in my life for a new relationship, and I can't unless I do this. But for parental stuff, for the death of a child, people often have a lot of shame about that they need that touchstone. I don't know if you guys know the website Post Secret, where people, make postcards anonymously and they send in their secrets. There was just like this really heartbreaking one of this woman who's like, I have all the clothes we bought for the baby I miscarried, and sometimes I go in this room and I just touch her clothes. And that doesn't necessarily mean she's a hoarder, that she has this one box of clothes, but it does mean she's having a complex grief reaction, right? And so individually, you have to know the individual to know what the right treatment plan is for that. But certainly that grief can be the catalyst. Really, we want to think about hoarding as the defense against these emotions, the defense against the grief, the defense against the fear, the defense against the rage, right? So that's why we have this behavioral manifestation. So grief is just as strong a launching place as anything else. And then the last thing we have on this slide, we've talked about items as definitions of others, but we can also have items as definitions of self. And what we mean by that is, let's talk, like I said, about the piano. Let's say I bought a piano or inherited a piano, and I like the idea of being a person who plays the piano, but I'm 45 years old, and in all the years I've lived, I have never prioritized learning to play the piano. And so something that happens, though, is if I decide to get rid of the piano, there's a little bit of existential loss where I'm kind of admitting that I am foreclosing on the identity of my being a pianist, right? I've decided that of all the branches in my life, that's not the branch my life is going to follow. I probably could have if I wanted to, but that's when I have free time, when I have money, that's not how I spend it. But what happens with hoarders is that they hold on to the idea, as long as I own the piano, I get to hold on to the idea that I could be a person who plays the piano. And that grief of giving up that identity can be really, really hard. Digitally, that could be that could be things like deleting stories and poems and things like I'm not going to be a writer, or those kinds of things. Or people could like their Instagram accounts and having thousands and thousands of pictures and things, and having to face the identity that if I took this down, I'm admitting that I'm not going to be an influencer or, a cam model or, whatever it is. And as long as I just keep creating, then I can manifest it into reality. And what's really crazy is that sometimes people are able to do that. So sometimes those things can hook people further and further into that behavior. Some of the really common information processing deficits, so some of the common neurological deficits that we'll see in folks with hoarding behavior are the following. In the categorization issues, they often struggle with knowing what is trash versus what is important. When we're talking about analog hoarders, or honestly digital hoarders, and particularly like email hoarders and things like that. They also struggle with over categorization and putting things in too many piles, and so not knowing what to do with it. So if I had a mug and I'm like, all right, I need to put this mug away, where does a mug go? If I have categorization issues, I'm like, okay, does a mug belong with the other cups? Does a mug belong, but I have lots of mugs. So does the mug belong with collectibles? But I got this mug from my dad. So does this mug belong with gifts? But this mug is yellow. Should I put all the yellow things together? Because I saw that in a magazine one time. And what happens is I get so flustered about where does this mug go that I get overwhelmed and I put the mug down and I walk away. Or some people will do things like, oh, I need like 3 mugs, and then the mugs will be in all the categories. People will do that with emails. I've had people be like, oh, well, I need my this email to be on both my email addresses, and and one person was like, and we need to print a copy, and I was like, slow your roll. We got too much. No, we need one place to go for this email. They're like, well, but it belongs in the category of updates to nurses, and it belongs in the category of updates to clinicians, and it's also in my personal file related to this patient. And I'm like, whoo, how about, that's why we have an EMR, right? That why don't we put all that data in the record and stop? That caused a lot of anxiety for that person. So interestingly, related to the categorization, we see either atrophy or some unusual shapes in the frontal lobes of people diagnosed with hoarding. And they think that they don't know how those are related, but I mean, we know atrophy, we know lower frontal lobes means we have challenges with executive functioning. I've kind of talked about this, but I haven't given you the term. Hoarders often struggle with attention issues, and so they'll start to work on something and go away and kind of like leave what they were doing. This I have taken steps to stop, because I did this in my email and it was causing me disasters. It's called churning. Hoarders, when they get anxious, love to do that. They'll pick something up, they'll be halfway, like, oh, I found this toothbrush. Toothbrushes belong in the bathroom. I'm halfway to the bathroom and I'm like, that cup belongs in the kitchen. I'm going to pick that up and take that to the kitchen first. Why am I walking around with this toothbrush? Wait, I need to take that laundry to the bedroom. Okay, well, I can't carry all this. I'm going to put this toothbrush down on the kitchen table and let me go over to the bedroom, right? So nothing ended up getting done. It just got moved. Digitally, what happened to me with churning is, and it was really more work churning, was I'd be halfway through an email and somebody would knock on my door And then I'd be like, okay, like and I would go deal with what I was doing, and I'd be like, oh, I need to write an email, and I would start another email, and somebody would knock on my door, and I would go, and I would come back, and I was going into my drafts, and I was like, I have 6 drafts about this one issue. Finally, I started setting a policy when people walked in, unless it was like a patient's on fire. It started to be like, have a seat. I will answer you as soon as I finish writing this email. Or if I knew I couldn't finish writing the email, I had to put it on a sticky and be like, finish email about PTO. Like, because then I know I've already started it. Because I don't really have attentional issues, but what I do have is a job that pulls me in 1,000 directions because we have, 40 or 50 patients we're treating, and 24 staff. So by the very nature of the disease and the things we work with, I'm going to be attentionally distracted. We talked about the memory deficits already, so I kind of won't go over that too much, but what we're seeing is what we call free recall deficits. So if I asked you, if you have good free recall, you can, if I asked you what you had for breakfast, you could tell me. But if you need cueing, which is what hoarders look for, I could give you a list of items and say, which of these items did you have for breakfast? And if they see it, they know, but they can't just spontaneously generate it. Perception. This is a really, really cool, I don't want to say it's cool, that's not the right word, but it's neurologically cool. A neurologically cool thing that happens in hoarders, which is called clutter blindness. They literally do not see the same things other people see. It kind of takes 2 forms. It's either that they have a script of the functionality of an object, but can't see all the challenges related to it. So I'll give you a good digital example of that one. Someone says, I have this article that teaches me how to boil a hard-boiled egg. That's not necessarily a bad thing, but I just real quick saved the file when I saw it online. And so it's named X23, string of numbers, like when you save a file, but you don't change its name. So it's called X2Z5XY1, right? And it's saved somewhere on my desktop. And it's a perfect example. It's a perfect guide on how to boil a hard-boiled egg. When I have to hard-boil a hard-boiled egg, do you think I'm going to go find that file of string of numbers that I don't remember anymore? Do you think I'm even going to remember that exists? No, I'm going to be like Google, how do I boil an egg, right? So I have blindness as to the utility of that object. However, this is the really interesting one. The clutter blindness is such that if you ask hoarded folks how bad, it's a form of denial, but it's also it's a neurological denial as well. That's why they have rating scales. So when you're doing hoarding assessments, you'll ask them on a scale of 0 to 5 how hoarded is your bedroom, and they will look at example pictures of what each of those level means, and they'll tell you. And then you'll ask their loved ones to rate it. And then you'll ask their loved ones to send you photos and you rate it. And those are often very different in their ratings. But one of the craziest things, I think this is so interesting, if you ask a hoarder who's been hoarding for a long time to the point where they have hoarded rooms out of usefulness, so you can't even get in there anymore. If you ask them to draw a floor plan of their house, they don't draw those rooms. I think that's so fascinating. They literally forget that those things are there. I think that's so interesting. And then we can dig in forever about what that means in terms of denial and all that, and terror management and compartmentalization. But I mean, they literally just carve those things off the floor plan, which is really scary sometimes when you have, for example, extreme cleaners come in and they're cleaning out a house and they're all of a sudden like, we thought this was just a nook. It's a hallway and there's a bedroom down there. Like, what is in there? They're like, oh, I don't know. Nobody's been in there for 20 years. What? you know? Um, so that's just a really interesting kind of thing. And then we've already kind of touched on the associative thinking, which is that they're creative, but they really can't focus on important details, right? So like for me with my file, like the Not Now Erica file was, I could, because I am a good writer and I am creative, I probably could have made every one of those articles uh, relate to my dissertation somehow. However, that would have made my dissertation like an 8-volume series. And was it relevant to the central thesis of my dissertation? No, it was not. So the relevant details were, I'm writing a chapter on, emotionally focused therapy. Does this article have anything to do with emotionally focused therapy? No, then it doesn't need to be in my dissertation, right? So, but I was like, oh, but it's really interesting, right? Write that paper next year. So, but that would be that associative thinking, which is really useful to me. It helps me do things like create this talk, but it's not useful when my boss is like, that report is due in an hour, right? So thinking about that hoarding kind of behavior and how even in a digital space where it's not clogging up my office per se, it's definitely clogging up my head and also can be clogging up my hard drive. All right, now this is a purely voluntary participation. If people are, if you just send it to hosts and panelists, I won't read it out loud. If you send it to everybody, you are welcome. How many emails do you have in your inbox right now? Leah's seen me do this before. So Leah says she's down to 3,000. Too many. Oof. Sorry, that sounded judgmental. I did not want that to sound judgmental. So oh, wow, nice. We've got some good numbers here. And these are not abnormal at all. So 159,000. Some people are zero inbox people, so there's a 40. I always ask people who have a low inbox number if they're an archiver, because some people are zero inbox people where they're just like, I read it, deal with it, delete it. I don't store that stuff. But a lot of people are archivers where they get stuff out of their inbox. But if I ask them how many emails they have total, then we start getting into the huge numbers again. Yes, yes. All right. Thank you. Thank you for everybody for sharing. Yeah, my numbers would be similar to yours. And I also, it also depends if we're talking my personal email or we're talking my work email, or this is a dirty secret of digital hoarders, my anxiety email, which is an email that you send stuff to that makes you nervous to deal with. And so you send it to a separate email to kind of keep everything emotionally separate. And you're like, oh, here's the email that I give people that are fun and nice. And I tend to not go look at the anxiety email, and that one gets quite large. I have decommissioned my anxiety email, but back 20 years ago, that was a behavior that I had that I've noticed in other folks that digitally hoard. So thank you for sharing. I really appreciate the vulnerability. And like I said, clinicians, I think, as part and parcel of our kind of what they drill into us about the inevitability of somebody coming after us, I do think we have kind of a traumatic hoarding reaction in our professional emails, but some of us, it goes across. I won't ask you guys to answer the other questions, but things to think about, because digital is so interesting. We talk about email, but there's also photos and pins and bookmarks and lists, and we're going to talk about video games a little bit and how you can hoard in those. But it's really interesting because the construct of digital hoarding is really primarily being studied in the realm of cybersecurity and the concerns of people keeping these massive amounts of files that increase exposure if companies were to be hacked or have files that have old loopholes of security measures in them, but somebody squirreled them away somewhere and can be used to backdoor security. Digital hoarding as a clinical construct really only started around 2015. And really, some of that is the cybersecurity as well with Van Bennekom. There's Neve and some colleagues are starting to pilot some digital hoarding scales. Again, those are largely related to cybersecurity, but they have some of the clinical constructs starting to poke in there. Now we're going to move into the talking about digital hoarding as it relates to people who present clinically with sexual behavior. So in February 2017, there was this story that went viral that allegedly this man in Japan was crushed to death under a pile of porn videos and magazines and CDs and all this stuff. And everybody started kind of blowing up about, this is how hoarding can kill you and how pornography can kill you. The way the story was put out wasn't true, but it does still have some clinical implications. So that person actually died of a heart attack, but he was a hoarder. He did have a hoard of pornography, particularly magazine pornography, and his body wasn't found until a month after he died because this giant pile of magazines was absorbing all of the waste from his decomposing body until it finally got real bad. And then finally somebody was like, we should go see what's going on in there. And it was bad. It was pretty gross. But what happened with that, and that was so horrendous, that kind of launched that whole story. But in the early 2000s, especially this was in Japan, there started to be discussions and concern over what was called kodokushi. And I'm sorry if I mispronounce that at all, which translates to the lonely life. There was an increasing incidence of young people and not so young people, but young people was really what was making them nervous in Japan, that were living very, very solitary existences, kind of sucked into the internet and video gaming and anime and different things, and having no social connections, so that when they died in these one-person apartments, nobody knew. And there's a lot of concern about, like, what does this mean for our culture and our future, that we're disconnecting from each other, which, if you work with particularly digitally focused sex addicts, connection and fantasy and isolation are big themes you're going to end up working with. So I will tell you, these variants we're talking about are not, it would be absolutely amazing if I had the time and wherewithal to do some like factor analysis kind of research. That's not what this is based on. I will tell you, these potential variants of sex addicted or sexually compulsive related hoarding are entirely based on the cases that I've come across in my clinical career and in the clinical career of folks I've worked closely with. So, but these are some subcategories, so we can apply the things that we've talked about with hoarding to these sexual cases. These are some subcategories to think about. So this is what I call the classic. So this person would also likely meet criteria for some sort of analog hoarding. The first actual case study of digital hoarding would be a case that fit this criterion. It was a case of a young man on the autism spectrum who would obsessively take photographs and then pore through his photographs and organize his photographs and reorganize his photographs. But he also hoarded physical objects, and it was destructive to his life in both ways, because he was sufficiently functional that he should have been able to be interacting with people or doing some schooling or doing some work, but he was really, really obsessed with these photos. And so what essentially the hoarding function in the life is, the function the hoarding serves is as an alternative means of emotion management, right? When I'm angry at my partner, I shop. When I'm afraid people will break into my house, I block the doors. When I am, um, when I am anxious, I, download a bunch of pornography. Um, Now, you could have a sex addict who is also a hoarder, but they may not be hoarding sexual material, right? So those two constructs don't have to be related. They could just be co-occurring, but you could get people who are hoarding pornography. But we'll talk about the kinds of cases that I've seen that happen a little bit more in. The collector. Now, the collector may or may not be a hoarder. So this is really important when you're talking to people about hoarding behavior. A lot of folks will say, well, I'm a collector. Well, what does it mean to have a collection? So I have the dictionary definition of a collection, which is an accumulation of objects gathered for study, comparison, exhibition, or as a hobby. So when we think about sex addicts and particularly pornography addicts, now I'm going to talk about, because this is a digital hoarding talk, I'm going to talk about pornography addicts, but you can also have who I might call the collector for people who keep trophies. Somebody had mentioned that in the Q&A at the very beginning, that people will keep trophies of their conquests as part of their sex addiction or compulsive sexual behavior, or sometimes predatory sexual behavior. They may not even be sexually addictive, but we might be talking about, in a really severe case, like a serial killer or somebody, but they're keeping a trophy. So when we think about pornography collecting, though, they often have a very curated set of items or images, and they keep those items to trade with others, often because they find the trading to also be emotionally satisfying. So that would be the person who keeps them to trade or display would be somebody that I would call more of a collector. Now, in the hoarding literature, and this is where I dug into some legal journals around some hoarding stuff that was kind of interesting. Some people who might look like hoarders, I would not call hoarders, but they have large collections of images because their images they are collecting are illegal. You see this a lot in people who collect child sexual abuse images. Right? They can't just Google that and re-find the image without potentially exposing themselves to law enforcement. So they often quite assiduously keep very significant collections of child sexual abuse images, not only because they're hard to replace, but also, quite unfortunately, to get new images. There are often on the dark web, if they go into the dark web trading sites, you often have to trade image for image, which means if you want to get a new image from a collective, you have to provide an image they don't already have. So you have to keep your collection going in order to be able to get the things you want. And there's a whole really creepy subgenre in the literature where they talk about like people getting really savvy and checking the the photo ID tags of particular images, which has really helped law enforcement, by the way, because there are known tagged images that are like flagged to law enforcement. They're like, we already know that these are illegal images, and when they are traded, we know that something's going on. But often people will try to repackage an old image or a piece of an image to try to get a new image. But so people who have these illegal images or things that would be difficult to replace. So for example, if I had an ex, so taking it out of the legal realm, if I had an ex who let me take all kinds of erotic photos of them when we were together, I might not get rid of any of them because it's unlikely I'll be ever able to take any more of them. So they may or may not also meet hoarding criteria. Again, it kind of depends on the way they interact with these images, the purposes of these images for them, their emotional response to these images. But this is a different kind of subset that we see that can look like hoarding, but may not be. Now, I want to make it a little easier. Back to the concept of collection, right? So in the literature, when you're talking to people about hoarding, there's some things you want to do when you're exploring, does somebody have a collection or does somebody have a hoard? And some of the common criterion are, do you have enough space for the size of your collection? Is the collection a secret, right? So if you're ashamed of the number of doll heads, that creepy image that I found, if you're ashamed of the number of doll heads you have, it might not be a collection. But if you keep those to trade doll heads with other doll head collectors, or you are the curator of the doll head museum, that probably is more in the realm of a collection versus a hoard. There's also questions of, for example, are you willing to get rid of or trade or sell a less preferred object to get a more preferred object? That's often what collectors do, right? You know, think about baseball cards. I'll trade you my 2 of this for your 1 of that. But hoarders can't, even if they could get a highly coveted object, they are unable to deal with the grief of parting with the first object. So that's where we can start to get into more hoarder type behavior. Then we have, theoretically, again, this is one where I'm stretching my connections a little bit, but I do think they're related. Potentially, I've seen what I would call some hoarding, or at least sometimes short-term and sometimes long-term hoarding behavior in people who are relationship or love addicted. We talked about this quite a bit. Some of it might be grief, and avoiding that pain of the ending of a relationship versus a hoarding pattern. But like I said earlier, consider those animistic qualities of their thinking. Like, if I get rid of this t-shirt, I'm throwing out my boyfriend, right? Even if, like, let's say the relationship isn't over and I'm still with this person, but I'm so obsessed with them. And if I got rid of this t-shirt, which is stained and full of holes, but that would be part of my obsessive thinking might say that might signal the end of our relationship. That was the day I threw out the first piece of our love. And so I have to keep every single thing he ever gave me. That way our love will never end, right? I've heard people talk like that. So that would be an example of a hoarding type behavior intruding into the obsessive relationship addiction. This was probably my first digital hoarder I ever met, who was a sex addict. He was definitely what I've called the completionist. So he described to me his very extensive set of pornography, but what he would do is he would look for a specific porn actress and he would be obsessed with her until he had collected every possible available image, video, secret videos, all the special, belong to my OnlyFans page, like everything. I had to have, this was pre-OnlyFans, but I have to own everything related to this person. But really his satisfaction, I mean, he masturbated to these things and he enjoyed them sexually, but really his satisfaction, his hoarder satisfaction, came from completing the set. And we realized that because as soon as he completed the set, it went in a file and he never looked at it again. He never masturbated to it again. And if I asked him, he'd be like, yeah, that woman's beautiful and all that. He goes, but I never, because the hunt was what was so hot for him, and the completion, the win of having everything was what was, it wasn't in and of itself erotic, but it added to the eroticism. And so masturbating to something from the complete collection wasn't nearly as hot as masturbating to his new acquisition. They might have co-occurring OCD when you see this pattern. They don't have to, but I have noticed those tend to go together because it feels there's some rigidity of thinking that shows up. And also, like I said, they're a way that was kind of a form of masturbation almost like a hoarding masturbation, was spending hours sorting the collections can get very, very soothing. And it's not productively, right? It's not I'm going through this to get ready to put it on display, or I'm going through this, even in the realm of pornography. Like if he were to say, I'm going through my collection so I can note which videos in a series I don't have, that at least has some purpose. To him, it was just the kind of sorting, touching, moving, going through these images by itself when he couldn't masturbate, or didn't, was in a place he couldn't masturbate, or had already masturbated, or, various things, like that would be a form of stimming that he could do. I use that term sort of loosely. I don't mean it in the autistic, I kind of do mean it in the autistic kind of way, but he wasn't autistic, but stimulating himself to soothing with that stuff. Then we have what I've dubbed the free-for-all, which are folks that are often ending up in treatment with some criminal problems, and is usually how they've come into your treatment center. And really what their behavior looks like is on various peer-to-peer networks, they are dumping, they want as much pornography as they can conceivably get their hands on. And I mean, that was the guy that I titled this talk after. Literally, his goal was to own all the pornography on the internet. That was his goal, So I was like, that is a magical thinking goal, given the amount of pornography that is uploaded and created every day. Because I know, but that would be the ultimate win, is to have all the pornography. Because in his magical thinking, and he wasn't psychotic, he was a very intelligent man, but his fantasy was that somewhere in all the pornography was the perfect image, right? The most erotic, the most powerful, the most soothing, the most attaching, whatever it was, the perfect thing in there. Now, so that drives the collecting behavior, but I also think, having talked to a number of these guys, that part of the reason the behavior is so pleasurable to them is that it's so intense, it's so much that they almost go numb in response, right? So I have like the soothing intensity of the sheer volume just kind of overwhelms their anxiety response and drives them into numbness, which, if you're very anxious, could be sufficiently pleasurable. It might not be pleasure, it might not be comfort, but it's an absence of anxiety, and I'll take it. When you meet these folks, their pornography collections, compared to, say, like the completionist, are not organized. They might not be organized at all, but often all their organization is like September 5th, 2021. Everything I downloaded that day just gets dumped in a file. I might not even look at it. Sometimes it's just the pleasure of having it is sufficient. Sometimes it's just the habit of downloading it. I feel too anxious if I don't download tonight that I might not even look at anything. I have found these guys are often in treatment because they've downloaded child sexual abuse images. But here are the two kind of factors that I see over and over again. And to be fair, people can be lying to me. They certainly have self-interest in not acknowledging their real motives. But what I find is they're often in this group not actually using search terms that would get them that pornography. Other people are like, I wasn't looking for child sexual abuse images. And I'm like, what did you type in the chat box? And they're like, preteen hardcore. And I was like, what did you think you were going to get? Right? Like, that person is clearly looking for child imagery. Now, these guys just type pornography into one of the peer-to-peer networks, like old school, like Napster and things like that, and just hit download all. Here's this flood of thousands and thousands of images, and they will have child imagery in there. Now, I usually dig in and I ask them, and I'm like, did you open it? Did you masturbate to it? And sometimes they have, and then that's a different discussion. But a lot of these guys, if it's really about the hoarding behavior, they will deny interest in the imagery. Sometimes even the forensic analysis will show they never opened the images. But here's the thing that is a little scary in their addiction. they're not particularly distressed that they have child pornography on their computers. They're just like, I downloaded a bunch of stuff. I'm like, yeah, if I downloaded a bunch of stuff and found out some of it was illegal material, I would be very, very upset. I would be calling people. And they're just like, I don't know what's on my computer. And I'm like, doesn't it upset you? And they're like, So that's an interesting pattern that has kind of evolved from this particular kind of digital pattern I've seen. Now, co-occurring addictions that we often can see with hoarding and digital hoarding, the gamers, they can have a lot of reasons to hoard within their video game platforms. Most particularly is that the game will built in, I said the game might reinforce unintentionally. Actually, the more I learn about game theory and the more I think about it, that scarcity is reinforced intentionally, right? Because the whole goal, and I love video games, so I'm not knocking them, but the whole goal of video games is to get you to play more of the video game, right? Is to get you to want to buy the content, to play it longer, to spend more time on it. And so if I make it so that you have to have 5 rat pelts to complete this next step of your quest, it behooves me to, as a game designer who doesn't want to have to be churning out new content every 3 days, to make sure that every rat doesn't drop a pelt, right? I can even use that model within video gamings to make people go back and replay old content. So I play World of Warcraft, and they're notoriously good at this, and I love them to death, but it's a thing they do. And I don't mind it because it refreshes content for me, but some people it really upsets. They might make some new content, so there's a new area you can access, but you need to go back and collect something from an old area, maybe that was put out 2 years ago, because we want you to have to do some stuff over there and revisit that content. And it means we don't have to build new content to keep the story flow going. Very smart on their part, very economical in terms of their digital resources. But why do people hoard in a video game? Well, they might hoard because they're like, I'm gonna need these rat pelts someday, so I got to keep all the rat pelts. That definitely happens. There's also the aspect of being a completionist, because a lot of video games have put in achievements for finishing things or having things or doing things, which are very, very reinforcing. There's also a feeling that people can have if they've got the stuff. It's kind of like being a drug dealer. You can feel really needed or be the go-to, where people are like, I need rat pelts. And you're like, I got rat pelts. Let's be friends, right? So it gives someone a sense of purpose. So that's another kind of place where you can see some hoarding behavior. Workaholics, the one insight that I really like knocked a friend on her rump about was she kept talking about efficiency. And finally I said to her, you talk about efficiency like hoarders talk about organization. And she's like, what do you mean? I said, I don't think you want to be efficient to have more free time. I think you want to be efficient to put more work on your plate. And she's like, I was like, oh, I hope we're still friends after that. She's like, oh, I got to go away and think about that hard truth, because that is what hoarders do, right? If I can get you to put everything in nice, neat boxes, I can fit more things in here than when they were all tossed around. But we do, not we, but some people, like I have some I in this one, but hoard work because it gives us a sense of purpose, right? That's what workaholics struggle with, is what's my value if I'm not producing? And so I will hoard work is one form of digital hoarding. Another form of digital hoarding is, like I said, there's a false belief that workaholics can have around the accessibility of data. Somewhere in my millions of emails, I know exactly how to get to that one email quickly. I talked about separating emails to manage anxiety. And that one thing that shows up as maybe a hoarding, maybe a pseudo hoarding, is that you never prioritize cleaning, you never prioritize purging that kind of stuff. And what's really crazy making, particularly for workaholic digital hoarders, is that evidence of importance is if you're the person where somebody's like, oh crap, we need the specs on the Johnson file and it was from 15 years ago and nobody's going to know where that is. And you're like, I know where the specs on the, and they're like, not the last ones, but the second to last ones where we made that change. You're like, I got it. And if you can be the person who shows up with it, it can be really, really validating, right? And of course, it validates like, this is why I can't get rid of any emails. So definitely, somebody had made a comment about that it can also be soothing because it gives a sense of purpose and control. Work does, and also the hoarding does, right? If you are in a crazy workplace, getting a sense of mastery over your information and over your images and over your emails and over your phone calls, like, can give you a sense of stability. But really with workaholics, the big one I see is the email hoarding. And what's challenging is, again, like I said, particularly companies and the IT departments at companies do not want people hoarding certain kinds of data because of the vulnerabilities it creates within the system. But people are loath to stop doing it because it makes them anxious to get rid of it. We talked about shopping a lot throughout this talk already. Now, with a co-occurring sex addict, you want to make sure that the shopping, if there's a shopping addiction, you want to separate it from shopping behavior related to I'm buying objects for the sex addiction, and that's really the primary addiction versus the shopping addiction. But you can certainly have both. A digital shopping addiction might be, as related to a sex addict, might be somebody who purchases a lot of pornography, purchases a lot of things that are hidden behind paywalls and things like that. Or shopping pornography or shopping sex addict that's not a pornography addict per se, might be somebody who's working with a sex worker, say like a dominatrix, and she requires a certain, you have to buy me these things. They might not be addicted to the shopping per se, but they might, right? And it might be extra compelling if they are a shopaholic as well as addicted to the relationship they have with that sex worker. So somebody asked earlier on, and we already kind of, you guys asked good questions, so I got ahead of myself in the talk, but a lot of cyber hoarding, I believe, actually does have to do with attachment. It has to do, like I said, with fear of being punished, with fear of feeling like you are leaving people out, with fear of you will disappoint people, those kinds of things. And so keeping all kinds of digital stuff, it's still stuff, even if it's not taking up space. Like I said, it's the importance when you're working with this clinically is the space that it's taking up in somebody's head. It's really important to think about the stuff and what does it mean to own something. There's an implied responsibility when you own something to take care of it, to treat it well, to treat it with value, to treat it with respect. And people can really struggle with what does that mean when it's time for that object to be discarded. And this is really where we start to get into the existential sociocultural meaning of stuff. I highly encourage you to look up George Carlin's old comedy bit about stuff. Be aware there is cursing in it. So if that's offensive to you, you might not want to do that. But if that doesn't bother you, it's quite a funny discussion of the value of stuff when it's my stuff versus your stuff. We've known that even the pre-digital era, that stuff serves an existential value. So I have these statements like stuff gives us status. So he dies with the most toys wins, right? So my collection in life gives me some kind of status, but I put in, for myself, I put in the parentheses, but you also still die, which then takes us to these other 2 points below, which is in some cultures, I think both past and I think some present, honestly, there's a sense that our stuff is symbolically taking stuff with us to the afterlife, right? So if you think about the pyramids, or even I remember as a child seeing the clay figures that were buried in ancient China. They were like entire armies that they buried with the emperor, that were these clay figures, because he needed to take that with him to the afterlife, right? And so thinking about, if we believe that we can take our stuff to the afterlife, that's one sense of managing our existential fear about leaving this world. But then terror management theory says when we collect stuff or make stuff, it gives us a sense of permanence, which can lead us to force our stuff on other people, which says, as long as these photos are here, as long as this book is here, as long as these emails are here, I can never die. This stuff is here, essentially carrying me forward. And therefore, that will help me manage my fear. And this is a really unconscious process, but this helps me manage my fear of the unknown. Now, just briefly, and this is an interesting area if you want to spend some time looking at this in the literature, but there's some pushback about the concept of digital hoarding as culture policing. Who gets to decide what is the stuff of value to be saved? Why is Lolita a work of important fiction, but the Harry Potter erotic fan fiction that somebody wrote last week is not? Who gets to decide if it's not a matter of space in an actual physical library? Who gets to decide the value of keeping all of these things? It gets into some really, really interesting areas about all kinds of socio-cultural power struggles. So for those of you who are interested, I would highly recommend reading Statiki and Frost. They're kind of they're kind of like the big researchers when it comes to hoarding. Now, a whole bunch of people kind of around them do different structured interviews and hoarding assessment tools, but really, I really like the work that they do. And they have a couple of books that are highly clinical, and they have a couple of books that are very user friendly. The one that I like is called Stuff. It's just called Stuff. And it's very, very, it's easy for even a lay person to read. And it talks about the concept of hoarding. And then I mentioned earlier, right there at the bottom, Neve and colleagues in 2019 are starting to actually build digital hoarding questionnaires. It may or may not get you information that you need if you're assessing, but it's worth a look. Just to wrap up with some, what could we do about some of this stuff? I've sort of thrown these questions in throughout, but some things to think about. Mainly, how does this digital life, how is it affected by your collection, right? So does deleting a file make you anxious, even if you don't remember why you saved it? Do you miss important emails like bills and due dates and meetings because you have too many emails to look at? Have you been unable to find important things in the collection? On an individual level, this happens less, but on a company level, it can happen. Is there a financial burden created by the need for extra storage? So if we're talking about creating full backups of old versions of like programs, that can start to become quite large. Like you keeping backups of your emails, probably, unless you're in a larger company or a very small company, might not tax the server capacity of your company, but it can if everybody's doing it. Do you churn files? Do you organize files rather than deal with the emails that are coming in that are causing you anxiety about things that have to be dealt with today? Do you instead say, now is the time to organize the files, right? Sometimes it's good to take 20 minutes and do that and be like, whoo, breath of fresh air, nothing too heavy content. But do you choose to do that instead of dealing with the things you're supposed to deal with in your job or your life? Things to think about is common co-occurring. We've kind of touched on all of these throughout, so I won't spend any more time on them. But they can complicate the picture significantly, especially since you can have somebody with 3 or 4 of these, right? So when you're treating folks that are struggling with hoarding behavior, if you are a treating provider who's here, be aware of the limits of competence, work to get competence if this is something you want to keep doing. It's very important that the client controls the pace. Otherwise, they will often kick you out of the process. You want to reduce acquiring, because if they're acquiring as fast as you're dealing with the stuff that's there, you're just like, it's gonna really demotivate folks. You want to train specific skills. So the example, one skill like Frost and Statiki talk about a lot is Ohio, which stands for only handle items once. So to get out of that churning, if I pick up the water bottle does not leave my hand until the water bottle is either out of my house or the water bottle is where it belongs, right? And you really have to take this, like I said, at small paces, which probably will involve trauma work, because the hoarding is serving to block the trauma. How do we do some of those steps? Many credits to this article from back in 2012. Some people, you do email bankruptcy, where they just say, if you send me an email before this date, it is gone. If it's important, send it to me again. I know people that do that, not with their entire emails, but they'll do it over the holidays, right? They're like, I was gone for 2 weeks. If you sent me an email in the last 2 weeks, it's gone. If it's important, send me it again. Because so many things have already been resolved while I was gone. The unsubscribe button, somebody mentioned way earlier. So that's definitely one that people can use. So you're not getting kind of that digital junk email that accumulates and causes anxiety and takes up time when you're like, ooh, should I read that or not? Setting scheduled times to deal with your email or your photos, setting limits. I don't need 1,000 photos of this this particular lunch I ate. And then having a 0 email policy. Can I clean out my inbox day to day? And definitely eliminating peer-to-peer use, because that's a big zone of, it's kind of like carrying your junk mail in the door. It overwhelms everything. Just as kind of a note, radical cleanouts. So like I talked about how traumatic I felt it when somebody stole my stuff, but related, if a game crashes, if your email crashes, those kinds of things, or if the company comes and erases your email, or your house burns down. Radical cleanouts are generally traumatic for hoarders. They will often develop what are called rebound hoards to reestablish their sense of control, their sense of safety. It's interesting though, when you're thinking about if this is a behavior related to sex addiction, if we talk about needing to get rid of your stash, which is a really good thing to do for an addict, addicts shouldn't have their stash. But if we're dealing with a hoarder and we're telling them to aggressively get rid of their hoard, might we set ourselves up in a cycle where the person is unsuccessful at getting rid of their stash, because that's the part of the real addiction. It's compounded by the sex addiction, but we have to take a different tack than we would with just kind of what we call a classic kind of straight addict. If you have somebody who is more of a lay person, like I said, I really like the Stuff book by Frost and Statiki for the layperson, as well as The Hoarder and You, which is by Dr. Robin Zazio, who is on one of the television shows. And she talks about how that process can affect you emotionally. But if you're actually wanting to do hoarder work as a clinician, the Statiki and Frost treatment clinician book and workbook are where I would go with that. There are also, because it affects people, there are also local legal hoarding task groups. self-help groups. There is a Clutterers Anonymous, so it's not in a lot of cities, unfortunately, but I believe they have some online meetings, and I haven't checked since the pandemic, so that might have changed or improved. I know I rushed a little bit at the end there because I get so excited and I always go over time. I know it's super late for those of you on the East Coast, but there is my contact info. I'm always delighted to field consultation questions, have a chat with anybody, all that kind of good stuff. If you need to contact me about anything sex addiction related or related to my talk, I just love meeting new people and new clinicians.
Thank you so much for being with us again tonight, and all of you for spending some late night time with us. If you're on the East Coast, or those of you that are just, finishing your day with this little webinar, we're really grateful that you're here with us. Don't forget to check out some of those other sessions that we have coming up. And thanks again, Dr. Saar, for being here.
No problem. Thanks, everybody.